Boy, I got a list of questions that is just growing every time somebody gets up here to talk. Next, we are going to have, we're going to be joined to talk about the intersection of gender and race in modern American politics. A little more gender talk, we need that. Is Nicole Alexander Floyd. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies and an associate member of the Political Science graduate faculty at Rutgers University, a strong advocate for minorities in general and women of color in particular. She's co-founded the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, an organization dedicated to promoting the development of black women's and gender studies and supporting the professionalization of black women political scientists. An award-winning educator, she teaches a range of courses on black feminist theory, black women's political relativism, black women's political activism, and race, gender, media, and the law. Dr. Alexander Floyd is the author of Gender, Race, and Nationalism in Contemporary Black Politics and has written several other articles in several other journals. So welcome, come on up.
I want to hurt this computer. I'll just put this over here. Can we have some, put it down. Somebody's going to use it again. Okay. Can we have some lights? Or help me stay alert this time of the afternoon. Okay. I want to thank the CBCF for inviting me to be a part of such a wonderful panel. When my friends and I sit around, we don't talk about race. I'm a post-feminist, post-civil rights baby, and in my work I deal with more important things. These are comments from Shonda Rhimes, who is the writer and producer of Grey's Anatomy. Right? It's a very popular television show that has been hailed because it has a multicultural cast, because it has a cast that has a lot of female surgeons on it. But I want to begin with that comment because I think that it symbolizes the perspective of some people who, on the one hand, enjoy the benefits, right, of the gains of the civil rights movement and the feminist movement from the 60s and the 70s. And that's why she describes herself as a baby of the feminist and civil rights movement in some way. But evince little appreciation for its costs and certainly no burden for continuing to address structural inequality. In fact, as an important footnote, she doesn't deal with any questions about racism, for instance, until season 4, right, of Grey's Anatomy. It's a very short kind of, or limited rather discussion about racism, where it's defined as being relegated to an individual, right, someone who has a particular ideology or perspective about racism. So I think that it's important because it signals this push for quote-unquote deracialization, what people have talked about in terms of a deracialization strategy, not only in electoral politics, but also how it resonates within the broader culture in general. And so part of what I argue is that deracialization is a bit of a misnomer, right? It's the kind of approach to basically taking our eyes off of a black agenda, basically, of course, still has very serious racial implications. And unless one assumes that only black people have a race, right, or that people of color have a race, we can see that the particular policies that are put in place on platforms, the particular types of discourses that people generate are very much geared towards tying into certain white constituencies. And so that in a post, to answer the question about are we in a post-civil rights era, I would agree with Professor Walters. We're not in a post-civil rights era, but we are in an era where people want to, right, have a discussion about being beyond race. I prefer to think about this instead as post-civil rights and post-feminist ideology, right? It's an argument that people are making. And so what's the impact of those arguments? I want to very briefly today talk about two things in particular. Of course, moving to the assumption that the focus on deracialization is, of course, very much racialized, it's gendered, and it's classed, and its substance and its subtext. I want to talk about, first of all, how black women, right, operate as an implicit point of reference, right, in terms of campaign rhetoric and other political discourse. And secondly, I would like to talk about how this rhetoric deals with black women as elected or appointed officials. On the first score, I would like to focus on the Barack Obama campaign. Someone asked a very interesting question a couple of weeks ago at a conference. Said, well, people were talking about the impact of the Obama campaign, and said, well, what's the gender politics involved in this? And there really was a kind of very pregnant pause, right, a very pregnant silence. And so we've talked about how black women's attitudes have been important in terms of whether or not there was early support or not for Barack Obama in the campaign. People are trying to figure out where their particular positioning is in relationship to particular candidates, right? But part of what I think is important is that if we read below the subtext, right, black women have been critically important. For example, in discussions around the question of responsibility, family responsibility, social responsibility, as a point of emphasis. Many people, of course, focused on quote-unquote move to the right or to the center after Barack Obama received, basically had the nomination pretty much in hand. But really we can look back over several years, right, of his support for a break from his earlier critique of family welfare reform in 1996 to his support for it. He says what? Right, we didn't realize how successful it was going to be. Now, what do we count as success? And those of us who study welfare reform understand that, yes, the roles have been lowered in some cases, right? But that doesn't equal success because we've also seen an increase in poverty and we've seen more people, poor people who don't have access to benefits, right? And so it's part of what Professor Walters describes as policy racism, right? Part of a whole series of issues that we can look and see the impact of. And that debate around welfare reform was all about black women, right? It's centered on the image of the black welfare queen and also black female-headed single-parent households. Of course, it had implications and was critical of the black community as a whole, right? But so this particular focus, right, in politics, in general, not just in black politics, but in U.S. politics has been important. And it's something that is ubiquitous, right? When we look at, so when someone says that really this was a success, right, we have to question what's happening here and the impact that it's having for black women. So this approach at deracialization is actually a re-racialization of sorts, right? It's focusing in on priorities and interests that will appeal to white constituencies and a certain ideological constituency across race. We can also see just as important connection of the kinds of ways in which kind of stealth urban policy emerges around what's happening with the family, faith-based and fatherhood initiatives, right, which have surfaced in discussions about this particular presidential campaign year. Now, faith-based initiatives are not faith-based, I would argue. I argue in my book, everyone's pubbing their books, this is mine, Gender, Race, and Nationalism in Contemporary Black Politics. Faith-based initiatives actually are not faith-based initiatives, right? They're racism-based initiatives, and let me explain what I mean by that. Compassionate conservatism, right, this philosophy of the Republican Party, conservatives in general, is based on, right, these ideas about black family decline, about what's gone wrong since the 60s, right, narratives about, oh, how things just really, at first we had this idea of changing things for the better and having a certain type of access to formal equality, the vote, getting rid of de jure segregation, et cetera. But then it devolved into something else, right? And this has really hurt our country. If you read the writings of people like Marvin Olasky or Myron Magnet or Stephen Goldsmith, the architects of compassionate conservatism that faith-based and fatherhood initiatives are both linked to, it really reads like something from the 19th century or the early 20th century in terms of its racism, right? Discussions about black urban centers representing a return to the wilderness, right? Discussions about a kind of decline in morality and the American way of life. And so, when we think about it, too, the faith-based initiatives and fatherhood initiatives, which were both part of the family welfare reform of 1996, rather, these particular elements were actually put in place under a Democratic presidency. And so part of the broad, the discussion about, well, what is the context? It's Reagan, right? But part of the response that we've seen in the past couple of decades is basically the Democratic Party has moved to the right as well, right? And so that's part of the challenge of this environment. That's part of what explains the efforts of people to move politics in a quote-unquote deracialized perspective. And so we can see, for example, in the faith-based initiatives, the Bush administration targeting black churches in particular. He says very specifically that he knows that other people would apply for these particular funds, but that they would focus specifically on urban areas, and that black churches more than likely, more than others, apply for these funds. There were no additional funds put forth in terms of social spending, right? So it's basically, let's rehabilitate black people. Right. Let's give funds to institutions that can help shore up the morality of black people. That's what explains poverty. In terms of fatherhood initiatives, another type of stealth urban policy, we see the kinds of interests of fragile families constituencies, black and Latino communities being overwritten by the National Fatherhood Initiative, which has basically a different type of base, focused more on propping up marriage and less on dealing with other questions as well in terms of the financial component, in terms of jobs. And so undergirding all of this, right, getting back to the question of deracialization as a strategy, the Obama campaign, when people talk about these types of things, they don't have to say it very directly, right? Because we have implicitly, right, the way that coding works in the media, people can use just a word or a certain series of words, as we know, and they connect to that. So the black woman has been all over the place in this election, right? It's been implicit in terms of this discussion about social responsibility. What's interesting to me is that people didn't really get excited about the problematic aspect of that rhetoric until it was centering on the black male, right? The infamous Father's Day speech in June, right? So what people started to hear on listservs and elsewhere was, okay, well, Barack Obama is attacking the black male. Well, actually, this is part of the rhetoric that had been going on, that he had been talking about for some time. So when he spoke in Beaumont, for instance, Beaumont, Texas, talking about the need for families to make sure they were home for their children. And as I'm saying this, I'm not arguing, of course, that people can't make choices to vote for Obama in the national election. I'm just trying to be very real about ideologically what's happening, right, and where we are in this moment. When he said that black people should stop feeding their children Popeyes for breakfast, right? So these kinds of comments, right, fall within this paradigm made famous first by Moynihan, but by Ronald Reagan, right? And so we see that even those in the Democratic Party, even black elected officials, are picking up on this particular rhetoric. The protest that happened recently in Florida is an interesting kind of example in connection to this as well. In Florida, if you remember, there were people with signs saying blacks against Obama and the KKK supports Obama, et cetera. Well, the Michael Warren's group that did that actually has, as part of their political philosophy, a critique of the black woman, right? They said that black women, at least 33% of black women, are basically in league, and they use biblical references, particularly in Revelation, with the Antichrist, right? I'm not making this up. And so it is true. And Oprah was seen as a kind of key figure because she funded Barack Obama. They talk about comparisons to Lilith in the Bible and just end times rhetoric, but they talk about the fact that the black woman is in control and out of position, right? This links up very squarely with all this rhetoric that we've been hearing for decades about black female-headed single-parent households, about black women not knowing their place, this kind of blame the victim rhetoric that takes place. And part of what I deal with in my book is how we talk about black women as traitors, right? How that's a part of our political discourse that is also a part of what is happening here. In addition to, I think that the importance of looking below the surface and seeing how black women are implicit kinds of points of reference, we can think about what this attempt to quote-unquote deracialize politics, that particular strategy, what it means for elected and appointed officials. And part of what I do in my work, my current work, is to look at the connection between popular culture and electoral politics, because things like the movies, internet, sitcoms, they give us a source of racialization, right, or genderization. They give people their ideas about what the future should look like, what the present looks like in racial ideas. And part of what I think is a really key aspect of this post-feminist, post-civil rights ideology is what I call the rise of the quote-unquote super minority, right? As Fanon has famously observed, black bodies are generally received as phobic objects, right? They are the embodiment of darkness and characteristics with which it is typically associated in the white Western imagination. And so when people are, even as people are trying to counter stereotypes or make blacks more visible on the small screen or the large screen, what producers will often do is to construct characters that are, quote, purified exemplars of white cultural ideals that disrupt whites' normal mental associations, end quote, such that these characters are seen as not really black. Right? It's a move that implicitly suggests a liminal super minority status as a requirement for assimilation. So we see these figures, right, in popular culture and increasingly in electoral politics, right? The figure of the super minority that is seen or viewed as being symbolically, quote unquote, white, or the kind of direct opposite of a black prototype. But ironically, part of what people have been able to show is that, for example, with the Cosby Show, right, there's something called the Cosby effect, so that when whites watched the Cosby Show, it didn't actually dispel or discredit or change their ideas about black stereotypes. Actually, it affirmed them, right, because people are frame-driven or theory-driven, and so they thought, well, if blacks like the Huxtables can make it, it shows that blacks can make it, and others should be able to as well. Right, so that's part of the irony involved in the proliferation of those images. A part of the impact has to do with these particular images, has to do with a couple of things. First of all, it affirms, going back to the idea of two black Americas, this notion, right, that we have two black Americas. And I would like to say that we've always had cleavages, quote unquote, or differences in black communities, right? Under Jim Crow, those, I think, in particular, were not as simple for people to point out, right? But I think that it really is a kind of false proposition to suggest that, all of a sudden that we have two distinct, quote-unquote, communities. I think that that's a very problematic projection that people are making. And what I do I think is important to think about what the implications of that are. Right, because it suggests that there's a mode of assimilation, right? If one distances oneself from a black agenda, what we might associate with black interest as a road to assimilation, then it leaves those of us who are the least economically well off in a situation where they have no political positioning to make claims upon the state. Also, part of what it does, tying back into what Andra pointed out, is that it affirms a male prerogative for leadership, right? Because most of these particular figures or images are male, right? And even in the debates that people had, the controversy, the infamous hot mic controversy, people thinking about, okay, what does this mean in terms of the transition of leadership, right? What does this mean in terms of the type of leadership, the change into the old guard? A part of what I suggest is that but the bigger part of the discussion is that we're making an assumption, right, that we're going to have leadership transferring from one male leader to the other, right? where's black female leadership involved in all of this? Where's the prerogative for the place for black female leadership? I think that's something that people have to raise questions about. So the discussions about deracialization are gendered in that they're focusing still on a kind of assumption and a priority for black male leaders. And finally, part of what I think is important about thinking through post-civil rights and post-feminist ideology is the irony that even as people are trying to project this notion that we're in a post-racial, post-feminist moment, right, the lie of that is told every day, right? So part of what I examined in terms of, I studied Condoleezza Rice, and I just want to say up front that I don't agree with anything that she believes in politically. But it'll become relevant when I explain this in a minute. But, you know, the conservatives prop her up, right? Part of what I talk about is how conservatives prop her up as a representation of the integration ideal, that you can somehow leap over racism and sexism and classism, whatever, with a single bound, right? You just have your Horatio Alger, you know, bootstrap story, you know, in tow. But what has been the reaction to Condoleezza Rice, right, over time on the national stage? I mean, just in terms of her public reception, even people who want to critique her on the left or who are liberal-leaning, and with some very good arguments about that, refer or tap into a kind of register of really essentialized racist and sexist ideas about black womanhood, right? So you will have, I'm sure you remember the cartoons about her where she was depicted as a mammy, like holding WMDs and nursing them and saying that, I don't know anything about aluminum tubes, and correction, I knows all about aluminum tubes, which of course harkens back to Prissy in Gone with the Wind, right? We remember the Gary Trudeau cartoon where she and Bush are in the White House. You don't see them, and they're talking about the stretcher comment about her not knowing about Al-Qaeda, and they go back and forth, which seems to be a trite but at least professional conversations, like, did you read what he says, The King of Lies? Well, that's not strong enough, Mr. President. Well, did you read his book? Of course. He said, of course not. It's in a book, Bush says, right? And then she says, well, did you know about it? And she says, well, oh, like you had. And then he says, watch it, brown sugar, right? So, and as you know, brown sugar, most of us remember the kind of most noted idea about that deals with Mick Jagger, right? And his song, his scandalous song that referred to the rape of black women during slavery, right? And so they're not showing this picture, and the reader is left to think that they're in bed politically and or literally. She's depicted as a Klingon, right, a person of war. People raise questions about her sexuality. Comedians make jokes about her in terms of, well, you know, I hear she's dating a Canadian prime minister. Well, it's a great day for Canada, the first person to get a man on top of Condoleezza Rice, right? I mean, all kinds of jokes about this. So part of what this is doing is demonstrating the serious problems that people have with having a black person in that space, right? What Nirmal Pawar talks about in terms of bodies out of place. Certain spaces, certain types of contexts have a somatic norm. There's certain bodies we associate with those particular positions. Condoleezza Rice deals with racism and sexism, or she's confronted with it, whether or not she wants to acknowledge it, because she is a body out of place. Barack Obama, right? He talks about, you know, we're not one nation, we're not red, we're not blue, we're not black, we're not white, we're et cetera. But as we all know, this is why he has dealt with questions about his religion, questions about his politics, whether he's black enough, et cetera. It is disruptive, right? The presence is still very disruptive. So even though there's this discussion about getting beyond race and thinking about these candidates and these figures as being post-racial, what it does is to highlight how very much things are very much racialized and very much engendered and very much dealing with class. I think the response to this, just to sum up, has to be that we look beyond the surface of things in terms of how political platforms are presented to us, how political electoral strategies are presented to us, because they are implicitly racialized. right? Just because something doesn't talk about black people doesn't mean that there's not race involved, right? We have to disrupt this idea that only people of color are actually racialized in this society. And then, of course, to fight the demonization of black women that is rampant in black politics, and to dislodge the assumption that black men are the kind of rightful heirs of political leadership, particularly in a national context. And then, of course, we have this conversation, you know, every couple of decades about the third party option, right? When I spoke to some of my students last week about the black woman who's running for president, they did not know, right? Cynthia McKinney is running. Right? What is her platform? What is the Green Party? Of course, we know that people don't get, and third parties get the same type of oxygen, but if somebody can find Nader and put him on CNN or other places, then surely, well, C-SPAN did get Cynthia McKinney on for an interview. But it just speaks to these kinds of broader issues. And so we're not in a post-civil rights moment. We do, however, need to take seriously. I know that people, diminish Dr. King's legacy by focusing in and commodifying, right, the I Have a Dream speech, right, and the whole movement that he was a part of and that he was such a critical leader for. But we have to ask still the question, not judge somebody by the color of their skin, but by the content of their platform, the content of their ideology. And so the kind of yardstick of measurement of breaking a ceiling can't be what is useful in this political context. There are some people who support Condoleezza Rice, like Faye Walton, for instance, because, well, she's refiguring for young women what they can aspire to. But I think that it's critical to emphasize that part of what goes along with that package is how you get there. And so that these leaders are getting there in part because they are affirming the particular norms and patterns and policy interests of people who are in power. And with that, I'll stop.
Y'all don't know how hard this is for me because, most of the time when people talk, I get to argue with them when I'm in public. So that's what people pay me for. I am taking notes and writing down questions, so this is interesting. I got to restrain myself until the end here. Benjamin Jealous, is the new president and CEO of the NAACP, the nation's oldest civil rights organization. He is the youngest president and CEO in the 99-year history of the NAACP. Previously, Mr. Jealous was the president of the Rosenberg Foundation and also was the director of the U.S. Human Rights Program at Amnesty International. While at Amnesty, he led its efforts to pass federal legislation against prison rape, rebuild consensus against racial profiling in the wake of the September 2001 terrorist attacks, and expose the widespread sentencing of children to life without the possibility of parole. Mr. Jealous comes from a family of civil rights activists. He began working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when he was 18. This is a big deal that Ben Jealous is at the NAACP. This is a big deal that Ben Jealous is here with us today. I have kept my NAACP membership card because Ben Jealous is there. So let's welcome him up.
Good afternoon. First of all, we apologize to you for being late. I was coming down from Baltimore, and it's my third day of my second week on the job, so it's cool. Both hard to get out of the building and hard to get into town. And I want to thank Jamal for facilitating this and all of the panel. I was sitting there, and I also apologize to the last speaker for joking with my longtime mentor. It's a bit isolating these days, and seeing Dr. Walters, there's a lot to catch up on. But your comments really hit me. I was raised in two worlds. I was raised in the summertime in West Baltimore. I was raised in the school year in Northern California, amongst a bunch of, post-feminist, post-civil rights workers, because they had all met down south somewhere, working with SNCC or working on the women's rights movement, and that was the context. And so when I was a young organizer in Harlem working for the Legal Defense Fund, organizing mothers to stop the closure of a women's hospital, I had a talk with a reporter from ABC News. And he was talking that day to four young black men. And his question, or actually, excuse me, it was a female reporter. Her question was, why is it the hardest thing in America to be a young black man? So that they spoke to four of us. And I was the only one who rejected the premise of the question. I said, first of all, I just don't agree with your premise. You know, I've always believed that watching my mom's experience, my sister's experience, my grandmother's experience, that sexism and racism compound each other. So I don't really get the question. I said, but furthermore, I truly don't know a black person who wants to be anything other than black. I was the only person who didn't show on the news that night. The other three just got more time. I'm supposed to talk about sort of how these times we're in sort of impact the African American agenda. And I think it's important that we think short-term and long-term at the same time in talking about that. These are big times, right? We have a black man running for president with a real shot at the White House. We have a white woman running for vice president with a real shot at the White House. These are the times, the way that things are supposed to have been for 232 years. It's a big moment. At the same time, we're in a century where white people will become one of many minorities in this country within the next 40-odd years. That's a big deal, too. And it has led many people to say to me, well, do we even need an NAACP? If you have a black president, do you need an NAACP? And, you know, I took that very earnestly. I'm a trained sociologist, criminologist. I took that very seriously when I was first asked. And I was like, wait a second. I think the operative phrase in NAACP is double A. We're not the NAACP. We're not the National Association for the Advancement of a Colored Person. We're the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So let's just recognize that. You know, we've been this, we keep doing this, right? We get a black mayor, and first time. We get a black governor, first time. Folks are still struggling. Breaking glass ceilings is important. But lifting up the grassroots is our mission. I got ribbed by a reporter recently. She said, when I talk to all of you young folk, yeah, it's the second time this has happened to me this week, actually. So when I talk to all of you young folk, and it's weird, you know, it's weird to have been in this game for 21 years. I started as an organizer when I was 14. I started as a paid organizer when I was 18. I have a daughter that I'm raising. Life to me couldn't be more serious. I couldn't feel less like a child. And to have people call me, you know, a kid repeatedly. So I said, and the first black organization founded in 1909 that I took over was the Black Press. This is the National Trade Association. I was 26. Then maybe I felt like a kid. Now I have a lot of gray hair. So I said, you know, I was talking to you kids, you speak so transcendently. So, you know, the old folks don't speak so transcendently. I said, well, maybe that's because they're old, because when last time I checked when they were young, Dr. King spoke fairly transcendently. She said, yeah, but she said, they don't talk that way now. You guys talk that way now. I said, well, you know, you have to understand the challenge we have. So we have to do two things at the same time. We have to enforce civil rights, and we have to realize human rights. And the first doesn't require that you speak that transcendently. It really only requires you speak like a lawyer in front of a judge, right? So enforcing civil rights is about enforcing a social contract that's already been signed and written, already agreed upon, and like any other contract, a couple of good judges, a few good lawyers, that's what you need at the end of the day. Of course, all of us who have worked as organizers and, in the black press and so forth know that it helps to have a lot more around you. But to enforce a contract in the day is an argument in front of a judge. To realize human rights requires a plurality. In fact, if you want to amend the Constitution, as some of us suggested we should around the issue of education, it requires a super plurality. That requires you to speak transcendently. That requires you to put your arms around everybody in this society who's struggling and saying, we're all in this together. That requires you to talk like Dr. King did in his letter from a Birmingham jail to the guards about we have similar interests, even though you've been busting my ass just yesterday, right? So And at the end of the day, our job is to produce the mandate. Before I got this job, I worked very hard for Barack Obama with a group called Power Pack. And the reality is, I know that when he becomes president of the United States, he's president of the United States. And he ain't going to act right unless we make him act right. I mean, that's just the reality when you're president of the United States. Even if they want to do it in their heart, they have to at least convince the rest of the public that they had no other choice. And that's what our job is. It also means, going back to transcendently, that we have to recognize where those interests exist and be willing to adjust our thinking slightly. I'll give you an example. The last almost 4 years, I've been running a foundation in California that exclusively funds civil rights advocacy. It's what we've done for 72 years, or at least since issues around blacks coming into Bayview Hunters Point to work in the shipyards in the early 1940s. We were founded a few years before that. And then with Japanese Americans again. And so right now, that foundation, the Rosenberg Foundation, one of a number of foundations who have invested in trying to figure out how to beat Ward Connerly. And I spent much of the last 3.5 years trying to figure out how to restore affirmative action to the public sector in California. Second thing I did on that, about 4 months of coming on the job, was to commission a study on the impact of Proposition 209 on minority contracting by the California Department of Transportation. We couldn't afford to do it on both minority and women-owned businesses, so we talked to the Ford Foundation doing a parallel report a couple months later. And what we found was this bizarre, but, not bizarre, actually very common but disappointing racial hierarchy, right? Overall, contracts were down by half, about 14 to 7%. For Asian Americans, they were down by a quarter. For Latinos, they were down by half. And for us, they were down by 75%. But the other thing that we could, and we knew how to deal with that, but the thing we couldn't grapple with was that there were about 6 white male-owned companies who, prior to 2009, got 70% of the contracts. And now we're up between 80 and 85% of the contracts. So you think from a plurality perspective, from a political perspective, not from a litigation perspective, but from let's pass laws and keep them laws perspective, then you got to recognize that between minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses and the 6 oligarchical corporations that get most of the money, there's a whole lot of other businesses. And we have to have a way in engaging them, because the goal is to get more of the 85% for everybody, right? And not just be fighting to get from 7 back to 14. The one major county in California that's been able to successfully hold on to and protect its minority women business enterprise program is Los Angeles, because they added an O. That was sort of the joke. Was, all we needed was an O. We could have saved in all these other counties. Minority women and other disadvantaged businesses. And that's all that it took. And so a disabled vet, arguably somebody who had a high school education, who was an entrepreneur, I mean, you could make all sorts of different arguments. We have to be thinking like that and having those conversations and figuring out, because we're heading into a situation where whites are becoming a minority. When you have the most privileged group in society becoming a minority, if you can't get out a little bit in front of it in your thinking, if you can't pull people into a coalition, start breaking off pieces, you're in for real trouble. Right? And we've seen that around the world. So that, I think, the impact of these changing times on the African American agenda is that we're back to speaking transcendently again. It's back to the future. I think it'll bring us very good things. Thank you very much.
Okay, moving right along. We're getting to the question part, which is inviting all of you to jump in and hear some of your ideas on this topic. But before we do that, we've got one more very important speaker. Gary Flowers is the Executive Director and CEO of the Black Leadership Forum, an alliance and clearinghouse for 30 black civil rights and service organizations in the United States. Mr. Flowers has served on the front lines of the American civil rights formation and policy served on the front lines of American civil rights and public policy analysis since 1989, having been trained at the historic law firm of Hill, Tucker & Marsh. Prior to his current position, Mr. Flowers served as Vice President and National Field Director for Reverend Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition. As an analyst, academic, and activist, Mr. Flowers has helped define the critical issues of his time and is one of the first people that I met when I came to Washington, so I'm happy to welcome him up.
Good afternoon and happy Wednesday. You're like, what's Wednesday? I take the position that every day that we are alive, we should be grateful for another day. So let the church say amen. Amen. I'd like to thank Dr. ALC Scott for all the work that she does at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for this invitation. And also thank Dr. Walters, who has really not gotten his due today. This is the preeminent political scientist in the country. I didn't say black political scientist. This is the preeminent political scientist in the country. Why? Not just because of his scholarship, not just because of his voluminous ability to write meaningful and effective books, but because he dares to speak truth to power based on his research and his data. So please give Dr. Walters another hand. And in his words, I am truly a just-in-time leader. And I want to begin with three phrases that I think give us pause to think. One is the African proverb that I am because we are. And because we are, therefore I am. So there is no individual advancement without group advancement. Two, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. Hello? All skin folk ain't kinfolk. And so to be a black leader or to think black takes intentionality. It's not because of your complexion. We see a man a couple blocks away at the Supreme Court, darker than most of us in here. However, he has chosen an ideology that's antithetical to the we-ness. Third, my grandfather with a third grade academic education, but worlds of wisdom, said, trust in God and check everybody else. We all have friends and family that we had to say, how did they find out where we were eating Thanksgiving dinner? Because you know Darnell gonna steal everything in the house. But about choices, I chose to study black. I chose to be trained by blacks. I chose to seek employment by blacks. And I chose to be a leader of a black organization. Now, I said that because I was trained in white schools. I got degrees from University of Virginia, went to a model educational school in Richmond that was mostly white. But toward Ben Jealous' transcendency, I'm truly black toward the transcendency. What does that mean? If America is a mosaic of, as Reverend Jackson would say, many faces from many places of many races, then I'm dedicated to that black tile right now in the mosaic. So I'm a coalition man. I believe in transcendency, but I do know that until there is an evisceration of group-levied discrimination, I know that I'm in the black box, and I'm proud to be there, and I have a true love for my people. And so does Ben Jealous. And so we can have, Dr. Du Bois talked about the duality of our consciousness. We can do two things, and more than that, some sisters in here, at one time. And so we shouldn't shun this false dichotomy of either you're in the camp of here or there. But we can do both at the same time. And so therefore I am a race man, and I'm unapologetic about it. There is no tension between advocacy and academics. So a couple weeks ago, an article appeared in the New York Times Magazine. Obama, the end of black politics, ? Since when did we even talk about the end of black politics? We have a continuum of leadership in the black community, from Nubia to now. And it's not based on age. Ben Jealous is 35. Have you turned 36 yet? Yeah, 35. Right. I'm 45 years old. King Tut was 8. Moses, if we believe the story, was 80. So there's never been a prerequisite of age that determines leadership. I would submit it's training, it's apprenticeship, it's vision, it's courage, and it's commitment. And by that scale, if we have to judge, I think we should look at black leadership in this country. And so when we talk about the idea, and I agree with Dr. Walters, perhaps we should have changed the title of this discussion today in brain trust, but then again, we shouldn't have, because that's what people are saying today. Post-racial this and post-racial that. Well, when I go outside after dark, I may or may not be able to catch a cab. Not because I'm right-handed or left-handed. Not because I'm Republican or Democratic. Not because I'm 45 or 85. Not because I have hair or I'm follically challenged. I will not be able to get a cab because I'm a part of a group that is marginalized from what we call the American dream. We were not included in life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness. That is not our way. We have come the way, treading the path that with tears have been watered. We have come over that path of the blood of the slaughtered. And so as James Weldon Johnson laid out our most epic anthem in the history of our people truncated into poetry, then we now may claim, have we not come to a place for which our fathers sighed? But have we? If we are in first or last place of major indices across this country that relate to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then we must question that. And we must rededicate ourselves to joining one of our organizations. I had a good friend from undergrad who told me a couple years ago that she didn't like a particular leader because he had, in her words, come down a couple rungs on her ladder. I said, oh, really? I said, you're a sister, are you a member of any black women's organization? No. You're in a sorority, are you an active member of your sorority? No. You're a lawyer, are you a member of the National Bar Association? No. You see where I'm going? After 5, I just stopped asking questions. I said, then you have no right to criticize the leadership that's on the field. My team sports days in high school, I remember there was always some brother on the sideline talking about who's playing. Well, you know he's starting because he's the coach's favorite. And they like him because he light-skinned it. But those of us on the field get our uniform dirty. And there are always people standing in the margins who have everything to say about black leadership. There is no problem with black leadership, and there shouldn't be any dichotomy between old and new black leadership. It is a continuum. The question becomes, where are you leading us? And who is following you? Because I would submit that leadership is predicated on having an army. If you're the drum major with no band, you're just a brother or a sister with a big fuzzy hat and a baton. So where are we today? Earlier we talked about new black politics, 1965. I would go back to the New Negro of 1922. Then I would go back to Reconstruction under Frederick Douglass in 1877. Can I get an amen on that? Now, let me digress 1 second. African American people have only been citizens in this country fully for 43 years. Huh? What is that Flowers boy talking about? We got the right to vote. Well, first of all, we got emancipated in 63 of 1800. We got 13th Amendment in 1865, the right to vote in the state, 1870. So what is he talking about? We didn't get the full right to vote with constitutional provisions until 1965. So we're 43 years old, acting like we're 150 years old. Now, having said that, there is a court case that will be heard beginning next week in the Supreme Court that will essentially wipe away the constitutional protections under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What does that mean? That means that what we got in 1965 could be eliminated by June. So now we have to rededicate ourselves not only to join an organization, but to be advocates for the we-ness and not just the me-ness. We need to be able to trust in God and check everybody. Okay? Now, toward transcendency, we have to sometimes hold our powder dry until we get in the place where we can actually make a difference. So I'm not advocating denouncing anyone. I am saying let them get there. But day after, let us rev up the army with a little question and answer period. Where are we and what is your agenda on these issues? Another point that was made earlier was this whole idea of new leadership. I'm not sure leadership ever becomes new. I think it either takes us in one direction or another. I will say this, learning from Reverend Jackson, and no, you don't have to rhyme to work for Reverend Jackson. But Dr. King trained all of his staff to take complicated issues and reduce them to 25 words or less. That equates to about 7 seconds of a microphone in your face. If you can make sense to people at the barbershop and at the dinner table and at the beauty salon in 7 seconds, then you have mastered that subject. So alliteration and prose and rhyme became Reverend Jackson's medium. But I dare to say when he says the poor pay more, simple couplet, but you know exactly where he's going. Okay, I wrote that, but he said it. But he did say this: one cannot pick up fruit from trees he or she did not shake. Hello? So those of us who've been on the field in civil rights for years have been shaking the trees. Now we got folk coming along, picking up the fruit, taking it to the market, making jelly, and not honoring those who shook the tree. Once again, leadership is a continuum. So when we discuss post-racial, then as my grandfather said, challenge, not only, this is the other thing he said, challenge authority. So challenge those who give us phrases that do not relate to our experience or to our hearts. And then do so in the self-affirming way that we've always done. And I end with James Weldon Johnson's words, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land. Thank you.
All right. Now this is the fun part, right? So there were a few things that came up. First of all, I didn't do this in the beginning, but I want to talk a little bit about how I got to be here. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, which I don't know if anybody else is here from Detroit. Detroiters are always real worked up about that. I grew up in a neighborhood called Dexter Davison. I'm the child and grandchild of civil rights activists and union activists. And my grandfather was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee for suspected of being a communist because he was a lawyer representing unions. And went to Morehouse College and went to Harvard University and came in here, was in Washington and worked for Bill Clinton and a bunch of other politicians. And I tell you that story to tell you that there is a bridge of experience that I think that people have, and not many of us fit into individualized boxes. We talk about this issue of transition. When asked about this, the analogy I like to use is that there are those of us who are sitting on the shoulders of giants. We are sitting on the shoulders of our parents. And like children on their parents' shoulders at a concert, your parents are being jostled, your parents they had their foot stepped on, people are elbowing them in the ribs, but you're sitting a little bit higher so you can just see things differently than what they see because they're at a different place than where you are. I couldn't be there if I wasn't on their shoulders, if they weren't dealing with all of the things that they had to deal with. But I may see some things that they don't see because they are at eye level and not sitting where I'm sitting. So in my career, I made the decision in my career that we all struggle to get to where it is to do something for black people or to do something for people. And I made the decision that I was going to play in the center part of the field, and I was going to, when I got into politics, for instance, when I went to work for Al Gore, when Al Gore was running for president, I had a couple different jobs that I could have taken. The job that I took was to be the deputy communications director, managing the national field press operation. In that job, I had 40 states under my control. I got to hire 60 people. I had a 900,000 person budget. I was offered another job to go off and be the political director for Joe Lieberman when he was going to be the vice presidential candidate. In that job, I would have had no staff, I would have had no budget, I would have had no states under my control, but I would have been high profile, and everybody would have known me, and I would have got to go to great events like this and give good speeches. And I chose to stay in Nashville and manage an organization because from that organization, even if I only broke apart 20% of what we were doing for African Americans and people of color, I could do more from that position than I could have done from the other. So I think there is a difference sometimes in perspective that does not necessarily mean a difference in goals or objectives, but we sit in different places and in those places we try to affect what we can. So I think as we talk about whether this is post-civil rights or civil rights plus what this is, I think all of those things are happening at the same time. So I'm offering my perspective to the moderator. I don't know how much you're supposed to do that. But all of those things are happening at the same time. And so some people are playing different positions, and we're all doing different things from whatever position we are on the field. But I do agree we have to ask what is the objective of the person from whatever position it is that they're sitting. So I do want to ask this question. We talked a lot about, I think in Professor Walter's position, he talked about black issues and black interests. And I would like to know, what are black issues?
The black agenda, first of all, let me say that people talk about the fact that sometimes that we all have the same issues. That's true at a very high level of generalization. But when you ask the question of how these issues, these generalized issues, cut in various communities, you begin then to define the black agenda. For example, we all want housing. Yes, except when you look at the gap between 72% white housing and 48% black housing, it means that you got to do something extra to achieve equality. We all want health care. Yeah, except that we are disproportionately out of health care insurance. And when you look at this study by the Institute of Medicine, it says that there's racism in the health care system. And we have to do something in terms of public policy to make that up. I could go on. I mean, all the way down the line. You're talking about mass incarceration, a whole series of those things make up the black agenda. Now, I will say one final thing on that I have not heard Barack Obama speak enough about the black agenda. And some of us have been critical about that. I love him, want to see him elected. I want him to carry us into the White House. I want that agenda to go in there in the door with him. And I'm not one who believes in indirect power. We are too powerful a people in terms of our vote. This time, we're going to be 20% of the electorate. That vote is too powerful for us to settle for indirect relationships in the American political system. So we have to take that agenda that you're talking about and make sure that it is surfaced and that he understands it. Now, I believe he understands it because, I think the brother is black. I don't have any worries about that. When I watch how I walk, I know him, I know that. It is. He's black, no question about it. But I'm not worried about him because we have, I think, too often analyzed this election in terms of a single factor, which is Barack Obama. Barack Obama is going to be the president, but it is the presidency that is going to govern this country. Let's understand that. And there's a whole lot of people around him who do not look like us, who do not understand our agenda, and those are the people we have to talk to. That is the reason for surfacing that agenda, because they have to understand, once they get in office, what it is we need. So we have to surface that agenda. Now, I'm sorry, but I'll say one final thing, and then I'll shut up, because this has been very close to my heart. We have been afraid to raise the black agenda because we have not wanted to disadvantage Barack Obama. Because being black, this is my 70th year, I don't know about the rest of you, but we understand that if we do that, then he will be vulnerable to racism. We understand that. So we are caught kind of between a rock and a hard place in this. But I think in terms of the integrity of our politics, what I've tried to do, and I very much appreciate the younger political scientists referring to it all of my career, was to develop an integrity in our politics which says that if we have a powerful vote, then we have to leverage that in the political system in order for the goods and services to come back to our community that we need. We have to do that through leveraging our political power and not being silent about it. The road we are on now is what I call, written in my first book, Black Presidential Power in America. The road we're on now is a hope and trust politics. And I've been on radio shows all over the country where people say, hey, stop that stuff. Just get him in. I said, well, okay, that's cool. But, that's hoping and trusting. And we've done that coming out of slavery. We are mature people in the 21st century with a lot of power. And if we don't begin to exercise it, we have no right to think about those goods and services not coming back to our community.
Good.
There were two studies that came out last year, or maybe in the last 18 months, about black men in a low-wage economy that caught my eye. One was a study that said that a black man with no criminal record has a harder time getting a job than a white man with a criminal record. The other was a study out of UCLA that said it was in the interest of most black men to have every employer check every job applicant's criminal record, because most employers assume that every black man is a criminal. Then you go back to the first study with a little bit of interpretation, and you say, okay, so then the supposition is that the white man who says he has a criminal record is an honest crook, and the black man who says that he has none is a lying crook. And of course, it's not just black men, it's black women. Black men are the most incarcerated people on the planet. Black women are the fastest growing population in our prisons. And our children pay the price, right? Because we're the only group that's overrepresented in the foster system, and it's by like a factor of 4. But when you look at that, what it suggests is that, and we didn't really sort of get to a point where we had desegregated every institution in this country until about the mid-90s, right? Going back to one but free for 43 years, right? And they were resegregating simultaneously, right? That's a whole other issue. But what that suggests is that we emerge from an American crisis, not a black crisis, an American social crisis defined by segregation just in time to show up for one defined by mass incarceration. The people say, you know, what is a, our wise facilitator said, what is a black issue? The reality is that race and the way that it cuts and that sort of hierarchy that study, you know, documented, that was just right there, you know, leaves us with a particular sort of attack against our families that's incessant and ongoing throughout black history. All right? The Middle Passage, slavery, Jim Crow, lingering segregation, mass incarceration. Now, one of the things that makes us more ready at this moment to see that as a black issue, right? Because it doesn't. What that means, you know, is that we're more connected. We're about 2 generations behind white people in the nuclearization of our families, right? So, you know, what does that mean? That means that when I was 5, growing up in Northern California, I spoke with a Southern Virginia accent because my mom, who left Southern Virginia when she was 6 months, moved to West Baltimore, moved into a neighborhood where everybody was her cousin, literally. I mean, we just figured out 3 years ago that somebody was a 5th cousin because that really wasn't a big deal in their little corner, you know, in McCullough Homes and Pulaski Street. So the reality is that I can sit in a room with 6 black billionaires, excuse me, with the stock market now, but half billionaires to billionaires, and bring them there for 2 hours, ostensibly, again, this is before I worked for the NAACP, to talk about Barack Obama, have them all be depressed because it was just after last Labor Day and he hadn't gotten the bump people thought. Decided to start talking about the need to elect more progressive DAs, particularly black progressive DAs, and the triumph of Craig Watkins in Dallas, for instance, and have them stay for 4.5 hours because every person in that room has a nephew, a son, a daughter involved in the criminal justice system. So we haven't purchased our way out. Now, the reality is that in 2 more generations, this divide that we talk about in the black community, which was one of the suppositions of that article, may actually become real. I mean, we've always had half the family was free and half the family was slave, right? We've always had some of the family went to college and some of the family, you know, graduated from the 3rd grade, right? We have that. I'm a Rhodes Scholar. I have cousins who are celebrating the first on that side of the line to get out of high school, you know. But we all know each other, and we all show up at the family reunion, and we all feel like that issue of a black man being locked out of the low-wage economy, even if it wasn't black women too, even if it was just black men, is our issue because it's our son, it's our daughter, it's our father, and we see each other, it's our 5th cousin, and we see each other as a family.
I didn't want to ask you for money.
So pay your dues. Right. But no. I mean, yeah, for real, right? I mean, that's, you know, so we have an obligation at this moment to make a conscious decision. See, because when you got to commute 20 miles into church, you're no longer living in the same neighborhood, right? To make a conscious decision about whether or not we are going to maintain a sense of community-ness. Sit next to some of you who work for Reverend Jackson, I can do that. Or not. Because everything, so success, going to college translates to you're out of the neighborhood, translates to you're in the suburbs, translates to your kid doesn't have the identity that you have, translates to it's hard to get the family reunion, translates to we're becoming more like white people who are simply 2 generations ahead of us in getting out of the agrarian norm. So I put that out there because there's this thing that they're saying that there's a division in the black community and it's new. It's not new, it's as old as all time. It's just that we're at a point where it could become more meaningful than it ever has been. And the only way to stop that really is to, as Gary talked about, join black organizations and decide that our families are going to stay connected in a way that American families, as they have prospered, have not.
Anyone else on this topic, or do we want to move on? Okay. I'm going to go to the audience. Let's go down here in honor of our elders.
Question, Dr. Walters. I read your article last week about can you hear me right now?
Hold on, do we have a microphone for the? And before you start, just give us a little bit of your name and where you're from.
Oh, my name is Ayuko Babu. I'm the director of the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles and Atlanta. I read your article last week in the Sentinel raising the question that the very little money is being spent with black leadership from the Obama campaign. I thought that that was very telling in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of folks around him appearing not to be aware of Kathy Hughes and the Sentinel, et cetera, and all the black organizations, what's being happening in terms of spending money. Can you talk about that? Anybody up there talk about is that a foreshadowing of things to come in terms of people not, because it's clear that Brother Obama understands Kathy Hughes and the Sentinel, but it's clear that somebody around him is not making that happen. Now, in terms of the troops rallying around and raising that question with those folks, what's happening with that? And is that the foreshadow of what you're worried about in terms of that reality?
First of all, I want to recognize you as a very central part of the National Black Arts Festival in Atlanta. And I'd like to say that the problem, of course, here with money is that, that I noticed, was that in going around the country, I'll be in Florida 3 more times before November 4th and other places, listening to audiences. One of the things I'm hearing is that they're not getting funded like they used to. Money's not going into black radio like it used to. As a matter of fact, somebody pulled my coat. They said in the first quarter of this year, Kathy Hughes' Operation Radio 1 ran a $7 million deficit. And I'm saying to myself, how could the Kathy Hughes network has 49 radio stations around the country in black neighborhoods, run a $7 million deficit in the middle of a presidential campaign with a black candidate raising more money than has ever been raised in the history of America? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I have been hearing this. And this is very important because I understand that a campaign, and all of us should understand, that a campaign cannot make direct contributions to a lot of the organizations we're talking about. But it can set up 527 organizations that can make indirect contributions. So we have a situation here where millions of dollars are being raised, and the organizations that in our community that normally do voter registration and turnout are not getting it. And as a matter of fact, the other day I was in Ohio. Somebody was telling me that the Obama canvassers are running up against other canvassers that are coming out of the local NAACP and some other organizations. And that's not good. I wrote about this in my previous book, Freedom is Not Enough, because in the 2004 election cycle, the same thing was happening, except that money was coming from very well-heeled donors like George Soros, you know, the billionaire, the shipping magnate, and some of his friends. $172 million finally made it into these 527 organizations that were Democratic-oriented. That money did not come into our community. Most of it, the money we should have gotten for voter registration and turnout as a proportion of who we are in the electorate, did not come into our community. We raised questions about it, wrote George Soros. He was arrogant enough not to answer our letters. I'm talking about a letter signed by Dorothy Height, Mark Morial, these kinds of folks. They did not respond. And so what they settled on doing was trying to run black voter registration operations in our community. Now, the Operation Black Vote was formed by the Joint Center. Actually, it was Big Vote in 1974. That's how long that our coalition of organizations have been running voter turnout organizations. A network of black churches around the country have been running voter registration operations for 30 years. And we have reached the highest level of voter registration and turnout in our history. And it was not because white organizations came in and registered our people. Okay. So now the danger is that if this continues, for the first time in 2004, the reason I wrote about it was that you begin to see the black civic culture wither. You begin to see powerful black ministers, big churches not in the game. You begin to see these organizations that have done this for a long time running deficits in the middle of an election, not getting money to a few weeks before November the 2nd. So what I'm saying is that he who think they can register and turn out your people control your politics. That's the ultimate danger. And so we cannot let anybody, I don't care, Barack, anybody, and his folks, register our people and let our civic culture wither. So now that's why it's important to raise the issue. It is important to raise the issue of funding, because we will end, and I think this has to do with something of the cost of a black presidential campaign. I talked about the cost before. This is another cost, because when this all ends, the irony is that a black presidential candidate will have raised more money in the history of American politics, and the black community would have gotten less. That ain't something about that don't sit, with me and shouldn't sit with you.
If I may, Dr. Walters, punctuate your point. In 2004, the Sierra Club was given $2 million to organize and mobilize black voters in black communities. Let me see a show of hands of people in here who are members of the Sierra Club. My point. His point.
Let's move on to the next question. Actually, let's go to the sister in the, with your hand up. Yes, you. Yeah. Where's the microphone? Oh.
Good evening. My name is Evelyn Gonzalez, and I have my own consulting business, and I'm also an educator and have been so for approximately 30 years. And at one time I did attend law school, and I remember studying late at night about the issue of race. And in my research, I found that it's really contrived by certain scientists coming from Europe and colonialism to divide and control people. And my concern is that we play into that something that was contrived to divide and control us and make it as though it's, a really part of us, when really we are about cultures. And I've lived and traveled to many other parts of the world. And we come out of cultures and out of linguistic systems. And we have different customs and ways of doing things. And we've also intermarried and intermingled historically out of biblical times. We have intermarried and intermingled. So to me, that means that we are more a part of a human race and of culture than we are of one system of race, as they try to break it down among European scientists coming out of colonialism, trying to divide Africa and other parts of the world. So that's my one concern. The other one is about the issue of deracialization, which I believe someone was talking about transcendence. And I lived during the time of Dr. King. I worked with him. I met him. I worked with him through the Reverend Dr. Fauntroy and Marion Barry here in Washington, D.C., breaking down the walls of segregation here in Washington, D.C., as a student at Howard University.
We need to get to
and
the question.
I come from an era where we're trying to really get at the content of our of our character. And so I'm concerned also about the issue of how certain people who have gone on and have occupied positions that normally we have not been able to occupy because we've been held back by our color and lies and stereotypes.
You need a question, I'm sorry.
So I want to know how we can overcome these stereotypes.
Let me address your first point. One of my undergraduate majors was anthropology. And it is true that there's no scientific basis for race. Linnaeus in 1636 out of Europe begins to categorize for linear purposes Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid. Thomas Jefferson in 1790 then infuses that into the American census for a hierarchical stratification of American society to put us at the bottom, therefore give us less rights. Having said that, in American political discussions, there are legal terms of black, white, and other. And they have all to do with what economics flow to black communities and what politics comes to black communities. So therefore, it is not an abandonment of scientific data. It is a reality that when I go out, once again, I cannot get a taxi cab outside. Not because I have a cultural difference, but I have a physiological difference.
Nicole?
And I would just also add that race is a socially constructed category, right? As is gender and other aspects of identity. That does not mean, however, that they do not have power or influence. I think the caution has to be in people assuming that if you are signified of a particular race, right, or occupy a particular gender or class position, that you can automatically understand how somebody's going to think, right? Because we have people who can be in the same exact social location, right, and they can have a different worldview, have a different understanding about things. I know that there's an interesting study. People asked. These researchers asked black women about experiences about racism and questions about, struggling economically or sexism. And so many of the respondents said that, they don't really deal with sexism. When these researchers asked them specific questions about whether they had experienced sexual harassment, whether they had experienced rape, whether they had experienced molestation, and the list goes on, they actually had a higher rate of response than their counterparts from other racial backgrounds, right? So it has to do with, how do we even understand and define, right? And I would, for example, challenge Shonda Rhimes is not that much younger than I am, 38. I think she's maybe 35. I'm like, it's difficult to understand, right, how she could say that, she doesn't deal with race in her show because it's just not something that, she and her friends sit around and talk about. I'm like, it's something that my friends and I, we sit around and talk about all the time.
Right.
Like, coming home, I have a message on my recorder from one of my friends, like, Nikki, call me because I have to tell you what happened at work today. And there's usually a couple of expletives may be involved. And, to deal with the realities of being black and female, whether you're in professional spaces or not, it's still a reality. So to answer your question, is it a social construction? Yes. But we still have to understand the challenge in this moment when people are trying to talk about being, because they want to get there, because it's an evasive maneuver. People don't want to deal with it's not just the historical legacy of racism, all right, the historical legacy of it's just the contemporary issue. It's not in the ways in which racism is happening. The poverty question, what's happening with the markets is just, so amazingly profound. It's really, I'm sure many of us are thinking about what the impact of this will be, particularly for poor people. Because when people have to make those adjustments in the budget, right, they're going to come after programs that disproportionately, quote unquote, benefit the poor. They're going to, so we have to gear ourselves for a resistance to that, resistance to trying to keep tax breaks for the rich, right? And understanding that, of course, it does have racialized and gendered implications, but to fashion that, going back to the transcendence, quote unquote, to fashion a political agenda that can have broad appeal, but at the same time understanding that racism is a reality, right? And it intersects with questions of sexism and questions of class inequality.
Ben?
I actually want to go back to the question that was asked a couple ago about funding in this race, and Dr. Walter's very insightful comment. I think it's important that we recognize the moment that we're in. You know, I mean, there's, you know, Gary couldn't catch a taxi cab 2 years ago. He's not going to catch a taxi cab 2 years from now, right?
I can catch it tonight.
Yeah. And he sure as hell can't catch it tonight. And, you know, my adopted brother is going to be, you know, strung out 2 years from now like he was strung out 2 years ago. And my adopted sister, who's, you know, has a felony conviction, is going to be wrestling with that. But we got 6 weeks, right? We got 6 weeks, and we got to live in those 6 weeks, even as we think about all these transcendent issues and the length of history. And it seems to me that there are two things that we aren't doing enough of in these right now, most of us, that we need to be doing. And one of them has to do with the Stanford study that came out this weekend about the fact that a ridiculous number of white people in all parties will not vote for a black person, right? And we need to, because people in this room are very highly networked. This is a serious room. Whether you're highly networked in Tuscaloosa or you're highly networked on K Street, everybody in this room is highly networked. And we need people to be saying to white evangelical ministers, to white corporate leaders, to white union leaders, that you need to put the message out that I don't care who you vote for, but it's time to move beyond where we've been for 200, 300, 400 years in this country. That it's just not acceptable to be in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, if you will, evangelical church where we're all praising God, and then we're going to walk out this door. And even though we love worshiping and we love listening to charismatic black men, we're not going to vote for a black man to be president because he's black. Again, I don't care if you don't vote for him because he's a Democrat. Just don't let it be because he's black. And we need to have that conversation urgently with friends. And it really, white folks have to carry that message, right? Like Dick Gregory said, you know, racism is the dog that guards the white man's house. If we could have killed it, we would have done it a long time ago. If it's going to die, the master's going to have to shoot it. You know? So that's one thing that we can do. It doesn't cost any money. It's a pretty easy call to people who you think can carry that message far in your community or in this country. The second thing is that we've got to see what may be in this moment the death or the faltering of a political patronage system as a moment to get serious about supporting the civic needs of our own communities. We've got to see it that way. We can sit around and be depressed and say, you know what, big white men aren't writing big checks to black organizations for this election. And trust me, it's caused me a few headaches on my last 10 days. And we will miss the point. We will miss the opportunity. See, that's been falling apart for some time. There was McCain-Feingold was passed. The Democratic Party panicked. I was sitting in Terry McAuliffe's office that day on behalf of the black press, and he was panicked, although he didn't act the way of the press conference. Then we had a couple of cycles of the Democracy Alliance and some billionaires doing their own thing. And now, for whatever reason, they've held back, maybe because Pluff and Axelrod keep putting out the message, don't give to outside groups, and they don't distinguish between C4s, C27s, and C3s. Okay, fine, it sucks. For me and anybody else who's running a black organization right now trying to turn out voters this election. But how many people in this room have given more money to Barack Obama than they've ever given to any candidate in their life? Right? That was what the primary was about if you believed in that candidate. This general election, what we need you to do, if you want to mobilize it, is to give more money to organizations. Our organization, the NAACP, the group that both of us have sat on the board of, the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. Your fraternity or sorority, if they're serious about turning folks out. Your church, again, if they're serious about turning folks out. But we've got to pass the hat. That's the only way that it's going to happen. We can say it's all goodwill and volunteerism, but the reality is somebody has to coordinate those volunteers. Somebody has to feed those volunteers. Somebody needs to make them feel special with a T-shirt. I mean, it costs money to get it done. And so I hope people in this room will think about that, and we'll talk about those two things to their friends, because we've got to change the consensus in 6 weeks.
I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to address one point, the question about race and people not talking about race. I don't think it's actually that unusual for young people to say they don't talk about race. I have a brother who is 32 years old. He's a principal of an all-black elementary school in St. Louis. He doesn't talk about race. What he talks about are parents who send their kids to school with bags of candy and not breakfast. Or he talks about kids who show up and they haven't been bathed in 2 days and whether or not they're going to be able to learn. I mean, so race is a part. We all understand that racism exists. Race is a part of what created that dynamic. But I think in terms of his day-to-day life, about what he's struggling with and what he can do to make it better, race is not really his problem. His problem are black parents who are not parenting their children. Not to say that all black parents aren't parenting their children, but there are some who are not parenting their children effectively. So I think, I just think in the conversation, we do have to be careful about the generalities that sometimes we strike, because not all black people are living the same lives.
Absolutely. But we have to be careful about not having a generality about questions of social responsibility. So the whole shift for decades has been on a focus on the microstructure of the black family, right? As if, if we can just have two-parent homes, then everything will just work out. I mean, that's one of the basic underlying assumptions. That has been a key paradigm for shifting focus away from what we think about in terms of structural inequalities. I agree with you, but I'm challenging a different type of generalization, right? And it's also going back to the question of perception. There are some people who can't read the kinds of inequality that's staring them plainly in the face, right? In terms of what your particular mode of interpretation is. So you will read a child who comes into your setting, who hasn't bathed, or all these different things you talked about in a particular way, given your particular ideological framework, your particular worldview, and how you're approaching that.
Okay. Right here, you had your head up.
Yeah, my name is Cynthia Elliott, and I'm the commissioner with the Rochester Board of Education. My question is a little different from what has been asked so far, but I think Mr. Jones, you talked about that in 40 years or so that the majority population currently will be the minority population. What will power look like in that time? My concern is that we may have a South Africa where you have a minority white population still controlling the various cultures that are going to be in this community, in our country.
We have parts of South Africa right now. I mean, let's understand that. There have been 3 countries to lead the incarceration index in this country over the past 30 years. The former Soviet Union, the former South African Republic, and our country right now. Right? So even if you take all the blacks out of prison, all the Latinos out of prison, you just measure the white people, we're still one of the top incarcerators in the world. And the reality is that given that both of those other countries are both former countries, we should take not just the social implications, but the political implications of incarceration as the panacea of social problems very seriously. If you look, and so I'm more concerned about that, about the impact of unchecked, unchallenged mass incarceration, and then this sort of quasi post-incarceration incarceration where people can't get jobs and they're locked out of the economy. Because I think if we change that dynamic over the next 40 years, we'll be in a much better place. And part of that starts with recognizing the commonality, say, between white people with felony records and black people with felony records. Right? Now, obviously, the black guy with felony record has it worse, right? But they're both struggling with similar things. And we are a very powerful people in this country in ways that we don't often, I think that we often take for granted. Our ancestral legacy gives us a lot of moral authority, more than pretty much any other group in this country. Right? Our tradition of motivational speaking gives us a lot of persuasive ability. The fact that we've been here for a long time inclines some people to trust us more than folks who have just shown up. And you see not just with Obama's candidacy, but with Ron, Ron from Oakland, who's mayor, who used to be Dellums. Sorry, brain blip. Used to be my mayor until 2 weeks ago. When he ran for Congress a generation and a half ago, the ability for black people, or for Barbara Lee now, to really hold sway over a very diverse population and lead in a way that is authentically black and rooted and connected to black people, but transcended at the same time. And that's what I'm talking about. I mean, at one point, I didn't hit home hard enough. When we talk about every child should go to the same school, that's a civil right. When we talk about every child should go to a good school, that's a human right. And we talk about it as a civil right, and we miss the point. We got to rewrite the social contract to get to that point. And so I believe that while taking care of our interests, because that's what politics is about, that the combination of going after, keeping in mind of where we're headed, going after the things that are really breaking apart society and balkanizing, destabilizing society, and doing it in a way that recognizes that even people who we have only talked about as our oppressors in most instances, as Dr. King talked to us about over 40 years ago, have common political interests that we need to recognize and exploit. Or we will go from being like South Africa in some ways to being like South Africa, as you say, and many more.
Okay, our time is up. No, wait a minute. No, our time is up. Andra and Tyson have not had a chance to participate, so I'm going to give them the opportunity to give closing.
To answer your question, I don't think that America's going to end up looking like South Africa, and just because I say that doesn't mean that I think that what we're going to end up being is going to look any better, or is going to be normatively any better. We think about sort of the foundational story of the United States, this foundational story of small L liberal republicanism. There's an inherent individualism in that. And when African Americans decide to link fate together, to decide that they are their brother's or their sister's keeper, we're running very countercultural to that, but we cannot assume that we don't actually that we're not influenced by the culture that we live in. And so that's what Dawson is talking about when he starts talking about two black Americas, that people are going to be influenced by their own class interests as, even as they're being motivated by certain types of racial interests. So what I think is going to end up happening in the United States, and it's funny, I just had this argument last night with a friend, in my hotel room about this sort of thing, is that as we see increased class division, we're also going to see increased descriptive representation, but that descriptive representation is not going to reflect everybody. So it's not going to reflect poor black people. And because of the narrative of liberal republicanism that we deal with, because of the bootstrap mentality that even some people in this room no doubt have, you're just going to look at a subset of the population and say, you know what, those people are beyond saving. You're going to end up with a permanent underclass. So yes, you can have Barack Obama in the White House, and you can have whatever nickname you want to put it on the stoop in the corner, and you can sort of live with that type of contradiction inherent in and of itself. So what I think is probably going to end up happening, and what my friend who's an economist was sort of prodding me to think about, and this was something I learned in sociology class when I was an undergraduate, was that what you're going to end up with is sort of the bifurcation being non-white versus white. So white and black, basically, or black and non-black. So you're going to have sort of this majority sort of black underclass, and you're going to have a non-black majority that's going to be actually very inclusive of Latinos, of Asian Americans to some degree, and we can talk about how different sub-ethnic groups sort of within the Asian or Latino camp could end up in this black category as well, and even a group of middle and upper class blacks who are going to buy into the American dream, who are going to buy into rugged individualism, and who are going to be fine. And as long as those people are in power, everyone's going to say America doesn't have a race problem. It's those individuals' faults for being in the position that they're in. That's unfortunately what I see happening.
I think it will look like South Africa. I think the golden rule applies. He or she who has the goal makes the rule. And I think that the reconcentration of wealth to the 1% is their plan, because they know what's coming 50 years down the road. And by the way, white folk think in 20-year to 50-year blocks. We think in 1 week to 2-year blocks. Either we thinking about what you're doing Friday night, or who's going to be mayor in 2 years, who's running for Congress in 2 years. So they've already thought this through. So I think it will look like South Africa. I think you're going to see the advent of multi-party proportional representation, of which Lonnie Guinier spoke in 1992 and was called a quota queen by Joe Biden. And so therefore, I think it will look like South Africa.
All right, Tyson, you get the last word, and that's definitive.
Well, there's a lot I can say about all that, but I want to make two comments. I find it a historical oddity that we embrace the leaders that were rejected at the time when they were making these arguments about expanding the discussion on race to include human rights. I mean, if you look at how King was treated during that time period, he was a race traitor because he was being contrasted against Malcolm. When Du Bois was arguing for a different notion of black politics, he was a race traitor because he was Victorian and he wore all these things. When black women were arguing that the black nationalist movement was sexist, they were, race traitors. So I think we need to have a different historical discussion about the possibility of arguing for humanity first and race second, or at least looking at race as a way of circumscribing our humanity, the ability to recognize that we all are human first. That's the first point. The second point I want to make is we do have to start thinking in sort of 10-year cycles. We really do. One of the reasons why black lawyers were sort of suspect about the Voting Rights Act is because it's a very executive-dominated piece of legislation. I mean, just think about it. The Attorney General has the power to interpret what the Voting Rights Act is, and the Attorney General is appointed by the President, who's confirmed by the Senate. So blacks, when you don't vote in the Senate race, you're automatically giving 33 people an opportunity to interpret the Voting Rights Act. That's number one. Number two, at the state level, the governors and the state legislators are the ones who actually submit these proposals. So if you're not voting at the bottom of the ticket for the state races, then you automatically give somebody else power to interpret the Voting Rights Act. All right. Number three, if African Americans at the state level are marginalized into these committees, you have wonderful descriptive representation and no power. That's the reality of the situation. That if we're going to play this like sports analogies and look about the helmet and all of that, playbook and all of that, okay, fine. Don't pick a team based on the color of the helmet. Pick a team based upon the playbook and ask yourself who's writing the plays. For far too long, we're playing Madden when somebody else is running the playbook. That is the problem in black politics.
We will give the dean, I will amend my earlier statement, we'll give the dean the final word, and then we will break. And everyone here will be available to talk to you right afterwards. So if you didn't get your question answered, just come on up and we'll do it.
Thanks. I just have a brief footnote to your question. And 3 panels this year with Latino elected officials. And so I did a little calculation on the back of an envelope. And it looks as though we really should be moving toward making a coalition, serious coalitions, with Latinos, because they obviously have a growth rate that's quicker than anybody else's in this country. When you look at the states that are 25 to 30% black and Hispanic right now, there are 13 of them. Those states together control 43% of the electoral votes. So it may be that what we have here is a situation where economic power and political power divide. Which is to say, you're right, I think, about the South African model. But it is also true that if we make effective coalitions going forward and take our place in many of these parliamentary bodies at all levels, we will have the ability to begin to direct resources in a different way.